This article is about watercraft designed for submerged operation. For other uses, see submarine disambiguation. A submarine, often shortened to sub, is a watercraft capable of independent operation underwater. It differs from a submersible, which has more limited underwater capability. The term submarine is also sometimes used historically or informally to refer to remotely operated vehicles and robots, or to medium-sized or smaller vessels such as the midget submarine and the wet sub. Submarines are referred to as boats rather than ships, regardless of their size. Although experimental submarines had been built earlier, submarine design took off during the 19th century, and submarines were adopted by several navies. They were first used widely during World War I, 1914 to 1918, and are now used in many navies, large and small. Their military uses include attacking enemy surface ships, merchant and military, or other submarines, aircraft carrier protection, blockade running, nuclear deterrence, stealth operations in denied areas when gathering intelligence and doing reconnaissance, denying or influencing enemy movements, conventional land attacks, for example, launching a cruise missile, and covert insertion of frogmen or special forces. Their civilian uses include marine science, salvage, exploration, and facility inspection and maintenance. Submarines can be modified for specialized functions such as search and rescue missions and undersea cable repair. They're also used in the tourism industry and in undersea archaeology. Modern deep-diving submarines derive from the bathyscaphe, which evolved from the diving bell. Most large submarines consist of a cylindrical body with hemispherical ends and a vertical structure usually located amidships, which houses communications and sensing devices as well as periscopes. In modern submarines, this structure is called the sail in American usage and fin in European usage. A feature of earlier designs was the conning tower, a separate pressure hull above the main body of the boat that enabled the use of shorter periscopes. There is a propeller or pump jet at the rear and various hydrodynamic control fins. Smaller, deep-diving, and specialty submarines may deviate significantly from this traditional design. Submarines dive and resurface by using diving planes and by changing the amount of water and air in ballast tanks to affect their buoyancy. Submarines encompass a wide range of types and capabilities. They range from small, autonomous examples, such as one- or two-person subs that operate for a few hours, to vessels that can remain submerged for 6 months, such as the Russian Typhoon-class, the biggest submarines ever built. Submarines can work at depths that are greater than what is practicable or even survivable for human divers. History. Main article, History of Submarines. Etymology. The word submarine means underwater or undersea, as in submarine canyon, submarine pipeline, though as a noun it generally refers to a vessel that can travel underwater. The term is a contraction of submarine boat and occurs as such in several languages, e.g., French, sous-marin, and Spanish, submarino, although others retain the original term, such as Dutch, Unterseeboot, German, Unterseeboot, Swedish, Undervattenboot, and Russian, Podvodnya lodka, all of which mean submarine boat. By naval tradition, submarines are usually referred to as boats rather than ships, regardless of their size. Although referred to informally as boats, U.S. submarines employ the designation USS, United States ship, at the beginning of their names, such as USS Alabama. In the Royal Navy, the designation HMS can refer to His Majesty's ship or His Majesty's submarine, though this latter is sometimes rendered HMS/M. Submarines are generally referred to as boats rather than ships. History. Main article, History of Submarines. Etymology. The word submarine means underwater or undersea, as in submarine canyon, submarine pipeline, though as a noun it generally refers to a vessel that can travel underwater. The term is a contraction of submarine boat and occurs as such in several languages, e.g. French, sous-marin, and Spanish, submarino, although others retain the original term, such as Dutch, onder the boot, German, unter the boot, Swedish, undervattensboot, and Russian, podvodnaya lodka, all of which mean submarine boat. By naval tradition, submarines are usually referred to as boats rather than as ships, regardless of their size. Although referred to informally as boats, U.S. submarines employ the designation USS, United States Ship, at the beginning of their names, such as USS Alabama. In the Royal Navy, the designation HMS can refer to His Majesty's Ship or His Majesty's Submarine, though the latter is sometimes rendered HMS M. Submarines are generally referred to as boats rather than ships. Early human-powered submersibles. 16th and 17th centuries. According to a report in Opusculum Taisneri, published in 1562, 2 Greeks submerged and surfaced in the river Tagus near the city of Toledo several times in the presence of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, without getting wet and with the flame they carried in their hands still alight. In 1578, the English mathematician William Bourne recorded in his book Inventions or Devices one of the first plans for an underwater navigation vehicle. A few years later, the Scottish mathematician and theologian John Napier wrote in his Secret Inventions, 1596, that these inventions beside devices of sailing underwater with divers other devices and stratagems for harming the enemies by the grace of God, and work of expert craftsmen, I hope to perform. It is unclear whether he carried out his idea. Hieronymo de Ayans y Beaumont, 1553 to 1613, created detailed designs for 2 types of air-renovated submersible vehicles. They were equipped with oars, autonomous floating snorkels worked by inner pumps, portholes, and gloves used for the crew to manipulate underwater objects. Ayanas planned to use them for warfare, using them to approach enemy ships undetected and set up timed gunpowder charges on their hulls. The first submersible, of whose construction there exists reliable information, was designed and built in 1620 by Cornelius Drebbel, a Dutchman in the service of James I of England. It was propelled by means of oars. By the mid-18th century, over a dozen patents for submarines or submersible boats had been granted in England. In 1747, Nathaniel Symons patented and built the first known working example of the use of a ballast tank for submersion. His design used leather bags that could fill with water to submerge the craft. A mechanism was used to twist the water out of the bags and cause the boat to resurface. In 1794, the Gentleman's Magazine reported that a similar design had initially been proposed by Giovanni Borelli in 1680. Further design improvement stagnated for over a century until application of new technologies for propulsion and stability. The first military submersible was Turtle, 1775, a hand-powered acorn-shaped device designed by the American David Bushnell to accommodate a single person. It was the first verified submarine capable of independent underwater operation and movement, and the first to use screws for propulsion. 19th century. In 1800, France built Nautilus, a human-powered submarine designed by American Robert Fulton. They gave up on the experiment in 1804, as did the British, when they reconsidered Fulton's submarine design. In 1850, Wilhelm Bauer's Brauntauscher was built in Germany. It remains the oldest known surviving submarine in the world. In 1864, late in the American Civil War, the Confederate Navy's H.L. Hunley became the first military submarine to sink an enemy vessel, the Union sloop of war USS Housatonic, using a gunpowder-filled keg on a spar as a torpedo charge. The Hunley also sank. The explosion's shock waves may have killed its crew instantly, preventing them from pumping the bilge or propelling the submarine. In 1866, Submarine Explorer was the first submarine to successfully dive, cruise underwater, and resurface under the crew's control. The design by German-American Julius H. Kroll, in German Kroll, incorporated elements that are still used in modern submarines. In 1866, Floch was built at the Chilean government's request by Karl Floch, a German engineer and immigrant. It was the fifth submarine built in the world, and, along with a second submarine, was intended to defend the port of Valparaiso against attack by the Spanish Navy during the Chincha Islands War. Mechanically powered submarines. Submarines could not be put into widespread or routine service use by navies until suitable engines were developed. The era from 1863 to 1904 marked a pivotal time in submarine development, and several important technologies appeared. A number of nations built and used submarines. Diesel-electric propulsion became the dominant power system, and equipment such as the periscope became standardized. Countries conducted many experiments on effective tactics and weapons for submarines, which led to their large impact in World War I. 1863 to 1904, the first submarine not relying on human power for propulsion was the French plongeur, diver, launched in 1863, which used compressed air at 1200 kPa, 180 psi. Narcisse Montoriol designed the first air-independent and combustion-powered submarine, Ictinio II, which was launched in Barcelona, Spain, in 1864. The submarine became feasible as potential weapon with the development of the Whitehead torpedo, designed by British engineer Robert Whitehead, the first practical self-propelled torpedo. The spar torpedo that had been developed earlier by the Confederate Navy was considered to be impracticable, as it is believed to have sunk both its intended target and H.L. Hunley, the submarine that deployed it. The Irish inventor John Philip Holland built a model submarine in 1776 and in 1778 demonstrated the Holland I prototype. This was followed by a number of unsuccessful designs. In 1896, he designed the Holland Type 6 submarine, which used internal combustion engine power on the surface and electric battery power underwater. Launched on 17 May 1897 at Navy Lieutenant Lewis Nixon's Crescent Shipyard in Elizabeth, New Jersey, Holland 6 was purchased by the United States Navy on April 11, 1900, becoming the Navy's first commissioned submarine, christened USS Holland. Discussions between the English clergyman and inventor George Garrett and the Swedish industrialist Torsten Nordenfeldt led to the first practical steam-powered submarines armed with torpedoes and ready for military use. The first was Nordenfeldt I, a 56-ton, 19.5-meter, 64-foot vessel similar to Garrett's ill-fated Resurgam 1779, with a range of 240 kilometers, 130 nautical miles, 150 miles, armed with a single torpedo in 1885. During World War II, Germany used submarines to devastating effect in the Battle of the Atlantic, where it attempted to cut Britain's supply routes by sinking more merchant ships than Britain could replace. These merchant ships were vital to supply Britain's population with food, industry with raw material, and armed forces with fuel and armaments. Although the U-boats had been updated in the interwar years, the major innovation was improved communications, encrypted using the Enigma cipher machine. This allowed for mass attack naval tactics, Rudel tactic, commonly known as Wolfpack, which ultimately ceased to be effective when the U-boat's Enigma was cracked. By the end of the war, almost 3,000 Allied ships, 175 warships, 2,825 merchantmen, had been sunk by U-boats. Although successful early in the war, Germany's U-boat fleet suffered heavy casualties, losing 793 U-boats and about 28,000 submariners, out of 41,000, a casualty rate of about 70%. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated the most varied fleet of submarines of any navy, including Kaiten crude torpedoes, midget submarines, Type A Ko-Hyoteki, and Kairu classes, medium-range submarines, purpose-built supply submarines, and long-range fleet submarines. They also had submarines with the highest submerged speeds during World War II, I-101-class submarines, and submarines that could carry multiple aircraft, I-400-class submarines. They were also equipped with one of the most advanced torpedoes of the conflict, the oxygen-propelled Type 95 Plunt. Nevertheless, despite their technical prowess, Japan chose to use its submarines for fleet warfare, and consequently were relatively unsuccessful as warships were fast, maneuverable, and well-defended compared to merchant ships. The submarine force was the most effective anti-ship weapon in the American arsenal. Submarines, though only about 2% of the U.S. Navy, destroyed over 30% of the Japanese Navy, including 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, and 11 cruisers. U.S. submarines also destroyed over 60% of the Japanese merchant fleet, crippling Japan's ability to supply its military forces and industrial war effort. Allied submarines in the Pacific War destroyed more Japanese shipping than all other weapons combined. This feat was considerably aided by the Imperial Japanese Navy's failure to provide adequate escort forces for the nation's merchant fleet. During World War II, 314 submarines served in the U.S. Navy, of which nearly 260 were deployed to the Pacific. When the Japanese attacked Hawaii in December 1941, 111 boats were in commission. 203 submarines from the Gado, Palau, and Tench classes were commissioned during the war. During the war, 52 U.S. submarines were lost to all causes, with 48 directly due to hostilities. U.S. submarines sank 1,560 enemy vessels, a total tonnage of 5.3 million tons, over 55% of the total sunk. The Royal Navy Submarine Service was primarily used in the classic Axis blockade. Its major operating areas were around Norway, in the Mediterranean, against the Axis supply routes to North Africa, and in the Far East. In that war, British submarines sank 2 million tons of enemy shipping and 57 major warships, the latter including 35 submarines. Among these is the only documented instance of a submarine sinking another submarine while both were submerged. This occurred when HMS Venturer engaged U-864. The Venturer crew manually computed a successful firing solution against a three-dimensionally maneuvering target, using techniques that became the basis of modern torpedo computer targeting systems. 74 British submarines were lost, the majority, 42, in the Mediterranean. Cold War military models. The first launch of a cruise missile, SSM-N8 Regulus, from a submarine occurred in July 1953 from the deck of USS Tunney, a World War II fleet boat modified to carry the missile with a nuclear warhead. Tunney and its sister boat, Barbaro, were the United States' first nuclear deterrent patrol submarines. In the 1950s, nuclear power partially replaced diesel-electric propulsion. Equipment was also developed to extract oxygen from seawater. These two innovations gave submarines the ability to remain submerged for weeks or months. Most of the naval submarines built since that time in the US, the Soviet Union, also known as Russia, and the UK and France have been powered by a nuclear reactor. In 1959-60, the first ballistic missile submarines were put into service by both the United States, the George Washington class, and the Soviet Union, the Gulf class, as part of the Cold War nuclear deterrent strategy. During the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union maintained large submarine fleets that engaged in cat-and-mouse games. The Soviet Union lost at least 4 submarines during this period. K-129 was lost in 1968, a part of which the CIA retrieved from the ocean floor with the Howard Hughes-designed ship Glomar Explorer. K-8 was lost in 1970, K-219 in 1986, and Komsomolets in 1989. which held a depth record among military submarines, 1,000 meters, 3,300 feet. Many other Soviet subs, such as K-19, the first Soviet nuclear submarine, and the first Soviet sub to reach the North Pole, were badly damaged by fire or radiation leaks. The U.S. lost 2 nuclear submarines during this time. USS Thresher, due to equipment failure during a test dive while at its operational limit, and USS Scorpion, due to unknown causes. During the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, the Pakistan Navy's Hangar sank the Indian frigate INS Kukri. This was the first sinking by a submarine since World War II. During the same war, Ghazi, a Tench-class submarine on loan to Pakistan from the U.S., was sunk by the Indian Navy. It was the first submarine combat loss since World War II. In 1982, during the Falkland War, the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano was sunk by the British submarine HMS Conqueror, the first sinking by a nuclear-powered submarine in war. Some weeks later, on June 16th, during the Lebanon War, an unnamed Israeli submarine torpedoed and sank the Lebanese coaster Transit, which was carrying 56 Palestinian refugees to Cyprus in the belief that the vessel was evacuating anti-Israeli militias. The ship was hit by 2 torpedoes, managed to run aground, but eventually sunk. There were 25 dead, including her captain. The Israeli Navy disclosed the incident in November 2018. Military. Main articles: submarine warfare, attack submarine, ballistic missile submarine, cruise missile submarine, and nuclear submarine. Before and during World War II, the primary role of the submarine was anti-surface ship warfare. Submarines would attack either on the surface using deck guns or submerged using torpedoes. They were particularly effective in sinking Allied transatlantic shipping in both World Wars and in disrupting Japanese supply routes and naval operations in the Pacific in World War II. Mine-laying submarines were developed in the early part of the 20th century. The facility was used in both World Wars. Submarines were also used for inserting and removing covert agents and military forces in special operations, for intelligence gathering, and to rescue aircrew during air attacks on islands, where the airmen would be told of safe places to crash land so the submarines could rescue them. Submarines could carry cargo through hostile waters or act as supply vessels for other submarines. Submarines could usually locate and attack other submarines only on the surface, although HMS Venturer managed to sink U-864 with a 4-torpedo spread while both were submerged. The British developed a specialized anti-submarine submarine in World War I, the R-class. After World War II, with the development of the homing torpedo, better sonar systems, and nuclear propulsion, submarines also became able to hunt each other effectively. The development of submarine-launched ballistic missile and submarine-launched cruise missiles gave submarines a substantial and long-ranged ability to attack both land and sea targets with a variety of weapons ranging from cluster bombs to nuclear weapons. The primary defense of a submarine lies in its ability to remain concealed in the depths of the ocean. Early submarines could be detected by the sound they made. Water is an excellent conductor of sound, much better than air, and submarines can detect and track comparatively noisy surface ships from long distances. Modern submarines are built with an emphasis on stealth. Advanced propeller designs, extensive sound-reducing insulation, and special machinery help a submarine remain as quiet as ambient ocean noise, making them difficult to detect. It takes specialized technology to find and detect modern submarines.
Civilian. Although the majority of the world's submarines are military, there are some civilian submarines which are used for tourism, exploration, oil and gas platform inspections, and pipeline surveys. Some are also used in illegal activities. The submarine voyage ride opened at Disneyland in 1959, but although it ran underwater, it was not a true submarine, as it ran on tracks and was open to the atmosphere. The first tourist submarine was Auguste Piccard, which went into service in 1964 at Expo 64. By 1997, there were 45 tourist submarines operating around the world. Submarines with a crush depth in the range of 400 to 500 feet, or 120 to 150 meters, are operated in several areas worldwide, typically with bottom depths around 100 to 120 feet, with a carrying capacity of 50 to 100 passengers. In a typical operation, a surface vessel carries passengers to an offshore operating area and loads them into the submarine. The submarine then visits underwater points of interest, such as natural or artificial reef structures. To surface safely without danger of collision, the location of the submarine is marked with an air release, and movement to the surface is coordinated by an observer in a support craft. A recent development is the deployment of so-called narco submarines by South American drug smugglers to evade law enforcement detection. Although they occasionally deploy true submarines, most are self-propelled semi-submersibles, where a portion of the craft remains above water at all times. In September 2011, Colombian authorities seized a 16-meter-long submersible that could hold a crew of 5, costing about $2 million. The vessel belonged to FARC rebels and had the capacity to carry at least 7 tons of drugs.
Buoyancy and trim. All surface ships, as well as surfaced submarines, are in a positively buoyant condition, weighing less than the volume of water they would displace if fully submerged. To submerge hydrostatically, a ship must have negative buoyancy, either by increasing its own weight or decreasing its displacement of water. To control their displacement and weight, submarines have ballast tanks, which can hold varying amounts of water and air. For general submersion or surfacing, submarines use the main ballast tanks, or MBTs, which are ambient pressure tanks filled with water to submerge or with air to surface. While submerged, MBTs generally remain flooded, which simplifies their design. And on many submarines, these tanks are a section of the space between the light hull and the pressure hull. For more precise control of depth, submarines use smaller depth control tanks, or DCTs, also called hard tanks due to their ability to withstand higher pressure, or trim tanks. These are variable buoyancy pressure vessels, a type of buoyancy control device. The amount of water in depth control tanks can be adjusted to hydrostatically change depth or to maintain a constant depth as outside conditions, mainly water density, change. Depth control tanks may be located either near the submarine's center of gravity to minimize the effect on trim, or separated along the length of the hull so they can also be used to adjust static trim by transfer of water between them. When submerged, the water pressure on a submarine's hull can reach 4 megapascals, or 580 psi, for steel submarines, and up to 10 megapascals, or 1,500 psi, for titanium submarines like K-278 Komsomolets, while interior pressure remains relatively unchanged. This difference results in hull compression, which decreases displacement. Water density also marginally increases with depth, as the salinity and pressure are higher. This change in density incompletely compensates for hull compression, so buoyancy decreases as depth increases. A submerged submarine is in an unstable equilibrium, having a tendency to either sink or float to the surface. Keeping a constant depth requires continual operation of either the depth control tanks or control surfaces. Submarines in a neutral buoyancy condition are not intrinsically trim stable. To maintain desired longitudinal trim, submarines use forward and aft trim tanks. Pumps move water between the tanks, changing weight distribution and pitching the sub up or down. A similar system may be used to maintain transverse trim.
The hydrostatic effect of variable ballast tanks is not the only way to control the submarine underwater. Hydrodynamic maneuvering is done by several control surfaces, collectively known as diving planes or hydroplanes, which can be moved to create hydrodynamic forces when a submarine moves longitudinally at sufficient speed. In the classic cruciform stern configuration, the horizontal stern planes serve the same purpose as trim tanks, controlling the trim. Most submarines additionally have forward horizontal planes, normally placed on the bow until the 1960s, but often on the sail on later designs, where they are closer to the center of gravity and can control depth with less effect on the trim. An obvious way to configure the control surfaces at the stern of a submarine is to use vertical planes to control yaw and horizontal planes to control pitch, which gives them the shape of a cross when seen from astern of the vessel. In this configuration, which long remained the dominant one, the horizontal planes are used to control the trim and depth, and the vertical planes to control sideways maneuvers, like the rudder of a surface ship. Alternatively, the rear control surfaces can be combined into what has become known as an X-stern or an X-form rudder. Although less intuitive, such a configuration has turned out to have several advantages over the traditional cruciform arrangement. First, it improves maneuverability, horizontally as well as vertically. Second, the control surfaces are less likely to get damaged when landing on or departing from the seabed, as well as when mooring and unmooring alongside. Finally, it is safer in that one of the two diagonal lines can counteract the other with respect to vertical as well as horizontal motion, if one of them accidentally gets stuck. The X-stern was first tried in practice in the early 1960s on the USS Albacore, an experimental submarine of the U.S. Navy. While the arrangement was found to be advantageous, it was nevertheless not used on U.S. production submarines that followed, due to the fact that it requires the use of a computer to manipulate the control surfaces to the desired effect. Instead, the first to use an X-stern in standard operations was the Swedish Navy with its Akula-Class, the lead submarine of which was launched in 1967, before the Albacore had even finished her test runs. Since it turned out to work very well in practice, all subsequent classes of Swedish submarines, Nacken, Västergötland, Gotland, and Blekinge-class, have or will come with an X-rudder.